Would you trust your life to someone who needs to be loved at any cost? He wears the symbol of hope, but his eyes reflect the emptiness of someone who feels no guilt. What happens when the supposed savior is, in truth, the center of his own worship? Get ready. Understanding Homelander means staring straight into the darkest side of narcissism, and perhaps seeing something all too familiar. Long before the spotlights glow, the staged flights before cameras, and the flawless smiles for citizens, there was only a cold cell. A clinical cradle surrounded by silent scientists. Homelander wasn't born. He was engineered, like a weapon meticulously calibrated. Unlike other heroes, he had no childhood, never knew affection, never heard the word son followed by an embrace. All he ever heard were commands, reports, and tests. From day one, his purpose was to perform. And at the heart of that performance, a void began to grow. While other children learned to trust, Homelander learned to doubt. The world around him was sterile, utilitarian. There was no place for play, spontaneity, or mistakes. Only excellence. Only results. According to psychology, the absence of emotional bonds is one of the foundational roots of narcissistic personality disorder. He wasn't shaped by affection, he was shaped by control. When a human being grows up without emotional connections, he begins to see others as tools or threats. And that's exactly what the corporation expected of him, a flawless machine of power and obedience. Inside that laboratory, what was being cultivated wasn't a hero, but a distorted mirror. Every gesture from Homelander was rewarded not with affection, but with metrics. Every genuine emotional expression was corrected, redirected, repressed. This process reinforced in him a classic behavioral pattern, the development of a charming yet artificial persona. Narcissists aren't born hating, they learn to seduce as a way to survive. And he survived by being adored, feared, and impenetrable. In his world, vulnerability was weakness. Love was a risk. Intimacy, a trap. But something deeper was growing within. The absence of empathy wasn't just a side effect. It was an active ingredient. To understand the danger this represents, imagine a mirror that reflects only you, never the other. That's how narcissism operates, like a lens that distorts the world around you to preserve an idealized self-image. Homelander was forced to create that image, and within it, he found refuge. A being perfect, indestructible, unquestionable. The savior, who never needed to be saved. The public figure of Homelander, crafted by Vought, was that of the ultimate protector. But inside that suit was a void as vast as the sky he sliced through in flight. When he saved people, it wasn't out of compassion. It was because it reinforced his role. When he smiled for the cameras, it wasn't empathy, it was a script. His entire humanity was replaced with expectation. And this disconnection from the self is one of the most dangerous traps of narcissistic disorder. The individual becomes a prisoner of their own mask. At the center of all this lies what psychology calls the false self. A persona built to protect the fragile and unknown true self. In Homelander, the false self became so powerful that it consumed any trace of the real. And so, even surrounded by applause, he was alone. A flying island, surrounded by adoration but drowning in isolation. Every "thank you" sounded hollow. Every gesture of affection, suspicious. And that subtle distrust is what turns an icon into a threat. But there was something no one saw coming. Something even his creators failed to predict. Because when you plant a hero without a soul, you harvest far more than uncontrolled power. You harvest an abyss that smiles for the cameras. For years, Homelander followed his script with clinical precision. He was the protector, the national symbol, the shining display window of the corporation. But a silent gear had already begun to grind in his mind. And the trigger wasn't an epic battle or an alien threat. It was a simple revelation, the truth about his origin. When Homelander discovered that he wasn't conceived by loving parents, but manufactured in a lab as a corporate product, something inside him cracked. not explosively, but like glass slowly fracturing from within. What had once been a necessary illusion now became an intolerable farce. Until that moment, he clung to the image of a romantic past, a mysterious mother, an absent but perhaps heroic father. That fantasy gave him an excuse to feel special, to justify his existence. When that narrative collapsed, it took with it the last emotional anchor he had. And with it, the idea of belonging. The question shifted from, "Who am I?" to, "Why should someone like me care about others?" Behavioral science shows us that narcissism feeds on idealizations. When those idealizations are shattered, what remains is a suffocating void. This moment is known as the rupture of the idealized ego. The individual, upon losing their central fantasy, begins to oscillate between deep rage and total withdrawal. In Homelander, this oscillation manifests as an even more rigid mask. His smiles become more plastic. His words, more rehearsed. And in his eyes, something begins to surface, a veiled contempt for anything he cannot control. From that point on, every relationship he builds carries a shadow. He approaches people not out of affection, but to ensure dominance. When someone shows him kindness, he interprets it as weakness. When someone confronts him, he sees it as betrayal. At this stage, Homelander begins to develop a kind of narcissistic hypervigilance. An extreme sensitivity to criticism, no matter how minor, and an increasingly urgent need for public validation. The problem? No amount of applause can silence an ignored trauma. This emotional rupture also triggers another psychological phenomenon known as symbolic re-traumatization. Every time he sees a happy family, every time he hears someone speak about love, loyalty, or empathy, he relives, albeit unconsciously, what he never had. But instead of sadness, he feels fury. And that silent rage begins to seep into his gestures, his decisions, his glances. With each moment the world celebrates the hero, a part of him mocks it from within. By this point, his narcissistic traits are no longer mere defense mechanisms. They become weapons. Charm turns into manipulation. Self-confidence becomes arrogance. Protection becomes surveillance. And all of it happens without him recognizing it as a transformation. For him, this is simply the truth revealing itself. After all, if the world is a lie, why should he keep pretending to be what they expect of him? And that's when everything began to unravel. When the myth discovered it was merchandise. When the man realized he was merely a reflection. And when the reflection began to look back, with distrust. What happens when a being who has never been loved discovers that love can be a useful illusion? Homelander didn't plunge into darkness all at once. He built steps. Each gesture, each choice, each rehearsed smile concealed an equation. A cold calculation. A new way of thinking. The forgotten child gave way to the man who learned to use his own emptiness as strength. On the outside, he was still the hero. Impeccable uniform, inspiring speeches, eyes that simulated empathy with perfection. But behind that controlled expression was a mind reorganizing the world based on a single variable, control. Homelander stopped asking what was right or wrong, and started asking what was efficient. His moral compass no longer pointed to the common good but to the maintenance of his image. And in this new logic, empathy was weakness, regret was noise, and boundaries were merely suggestions. Behavioral neuroscience calls this process defensive affective reprogramming. When trauma runs deep and the individual lacks healthy attachment bonds, the brain searches for compensation strategies. Instead of developing emotional connections, the person begins to simulate social behaviors to achieve objectives. It's what some experts call instrumentalized emotional intelligence. Homelander became a master of this. He read the emotions of others not to feel them, but to exploit them. The clues to this transformation appear in his subtle behaviors. When he speaks with allies, his voice is sweet, but his eyes are motionless. When he shows sadness in public, his gestures are choreographed. He feels no remorse for manipulating, because to him, everyone is part of the script. And if someone refuses to follow their assigned role, he rewrites the story, with coercion, with pressure, with fear. But always smiling. In moments of tension, he doesn't shout. He whispers. Because he discovered that silence, when coming from someone all-powerful, can be more terrifying than any explicit threat. This is the essence of structured darkness. It doesn't explode, it corrodes. It doesn't need to justify itself, it simply exists. And over time, Homelander began to believe he wasn't pretending to be good, it was the world that was pretending to deserve someone like him. The clinical analogies with narcissistic personality disorder become evident. Grandiose narcissism blends with paranoid traits, creating a distorted perception of reality. Everyone is against him, everyone is ungrateful, everyone underestimates him. He begins to see threats where there are none, betrayals where there is only autonomy, and criticism as aggression. And his response? Always disproportionate. Always calculated. Always wrapped in a veneer of justice. What makes Homelander so dangerous isn't his physical power. It's the fact that he truly believes he's above the rules. Not out of gratuitous malice, but out of conviction. Because in his mind, if he suffered so much, if he was created in a lab, deprived of love, turned into an icon, then he deserves everything. All the respect. All the control. All the devotion. But the real monster was still asleep. The one who didn't just want to be worshipped, but wanted to be loved, even if by force. Homelander always had a mission, to be the image of perfection the world had been waiting for. But over time, that mission turned into a burden. He was no longer just serving humanity, he wanted to control it. He wanted to shape the world according to his own vision of perfection. When he was forced to confront the true extent of his power, the world around him unraveled, and the line between hero and tyrant disappeared. The breaking point, the crucial moment in his journey, wasn't some grand event or epic battle. It was a simple, private sequence of actions. During a mission, Homelander found himself being questioned by his superiors. Questioned about his methods. Questioned about his choices. And in an instant, what had seemed like a simple critique turned into a trigger. What he had believed was unconditional loyalty turned out to be a lie. He wasn't being treated as the nation's hero, he was being treated as a tool, a disposable asset. It was in that moment that Homelander made his decision: if he couldn't be loved, then he would force others to fear him. To him, the alternative was clear. He no longer needed approval. He no longer needed adulation. What he wanted now was absolute control. And without hesitation, he did something he had never done before: he disobeyed. That act, that transgression, was the definitive breaking of all limits. The morality he still carried, that faint sense that there were rules to be followed, was dragged into the abyss. Homelander was no longer dealing with internal doubts about his nature. Now, he faced a terrifying certainty: the only thing that mattered was power, and absolute power had no rules. The moral dilemma that now weighed on him was disturbing. He began to question the very ethical structure that once sustained him. What if I'm right? He began to ask himself. What if the true order of the world is this? That only those with power have the right to rule. This thought slithered through his mind like a serpent, twisting his perception of reality, distorting his vision of what was right and wrong. For someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, the idea of being loved or admired ceases to be enough. What is sought now is total domination, the imposition of one's own moral code over everyone else. At this stage, Homelander is no longer a hero trying to protect the world, he is the master of this world, and anyone who opposes him must be eliminated, meticulously and strategically. It is not blind rage. It is not irrational revenge. It is a calculated, rational action based on a distorted understanding of reality. He believed he was creating order. He believed he was revealing the true nature of power. And that, by doing so, he was offering what no one else could offer: the truth. The truth that, in the end, those who hold power make the rules. It doesn't matter whether you are loved or hated, as long as others fear you. By breaking with his own morality, Homelander created a new standard. A standard where any sacrifice was justifiable in the name of control. And in this new world he imagined, there was no room for weakness, neither in others, nor in himself. And that's where the point of no return was reached. When power became more than a pursuit, it became a right. And when he realized that, in fact, there was no turning back anymore. Would you like me to continue with the next section or provide a narrated script format for this? Homelander believed that the reason the world didn't understand him was simple: people were trapped in an outdated morality, that romantic idea of good and evil, of right and wrong. To him, these concepts were obsolete. The real world was no longer governed by ethical principles. What governed the world was power. And when he began to see everything through this cold lens, his actions started to make perfect sense. There was no longer room for emotion or doubt. There was only the relentless pursuit of control. The psychology of narcissism is key to understanding Homelander's behavior. He wasn't just rejecting love and acceptance from others, he saw them as weaknesses, as human limitations. The concept of the shadow, in Jungian psychology, describes the hidden side of the human psyche, the parts a person tries to repress. For Homelander, this shadow was the acceptance of his own suffering. Instead of embracing the pain of rejection and loneliness, he turned it into motivation. The need to dominate and destroy anything that reminded him of that fragility. Personality disorders, such as narcissism, are often rooted in childhoods marked by emotional neglect and psychological abuse. And as John Bowlby's attachment theory studies suggest, the lack of strong emotional bonds in childhood can result in an inability to form healthy relationships in adulthood. But in Homelander's case, this absence of love didn't make him more vulnerable, it made him more calculating. Instead of seeking love, he began to seek power, which he saw as the true key to safety and survival. When looking into Homelander's mind, his logic of destruction begins to unfold. In a world where he held absolute power, others were merely pieces in a game. Through meticulously planned actions, Homelander imposed a form of justice based on pain and fear. To him, there was no regret, only results. He wasn't a villain driven by hatred, but by a need to prove his own greatness. Homelander's psychology can also be analyzed through the lens of theory of mind, a concept from cognitive psychology that describes the ability to understand the mental states of others. Homelander, however, lacked an empathetic theory of mind. He viewed others' actions only as parts of a puzzle he was putting together. He didn't see people as human beings with emotions, but as tools to be manipulated and discarded once they were no longer useful. Homelander began to realize that, with the fear he generated, he had the power to shape reality around him. He saw himself as the only one who understood the true dynamic of power. When a hero is loved, he is dependent on the affection of others. But when a tyrant is feared, he needs no one. Homelander believed that this understanding was the greatest advantage of all. He was more right than everyone else, and the world needed to learn that. Yet, there is something deeply disturbing in Homelander's logic. He was starting to believe that his destruction wasn't merely a means to an end, but the end itself. Every action, every move, every act of power had a justification, a calculation that rendered it unquestionable. But the truth is, this calculation was a false illusion. He believed he was in control, but what he didn't see was that by abandoning his humanity, he was becoming the very storm that would destroy everything he touched. And then, the final revelation arrived. It wasn't madness. It was cold calculation. Homelander wasn't making impulsive decisions. He was creating a mental framework that validated his relentless pursuit of power. Every step, every choice, every destructive act made sense within his internal logic. But the question is, was this logic truly functional? Or was it merely the repetition of a cycle of self-sabotage, disguised as perfection? When the final great confrontation ended and the world said goodbye to Homelander, what remained was not just the physical destruction he left behind, but the psychological void he created. His legacy was not a series of victories or accomplishments, it was a fragmented landscape where trust was broken and institutions corroded. The world no longer knew what to believe in, and in fact, many began to question whether he had been a hero or a dark reflection of what humanity could become when ego grows larger than morality itself. Chaos, disorder, the loss of control, all of it had been part of Homelander's plan. But what he hadn't anticipated was that by breaking everything around him, he was also breaking himself. He, who saw himself as the pinnacle of human perfection, failed to realize that his need for control had isolated him from everyone. He wasn't just dethroning systems, he was destroying what remained of his own humanity. In the end, he was more alone than he could have ever imagined. Homelander's narcissistic psychology prevented him from understanding the true nature of his impact. He couldn't see beyond his own distorted worldview. Instead of seeing himself as a fallen hero, Homelander preferred to remain a myth, a being who had transcended human fragility to become something immortal, untouchable. But in reality, he was nothing more than a product of his own delusions. He saw himself as above judgment, believing that his legacy would be remembered as that of a great leader, when in truth, it would be remembered only as a dark warning about the dangers of absolute power. Homelander's legacy wasn't, as he had hoped, that of an unbeatable ruler, but of a terrible lesson. The true impact of his trajectory was in how he reshaped the world around him. After his fall, people did not feel safer. On the contrary, they felt the emptiness he had left behind. In his pursuit of control, he had cultivated distrust. Believe it or not, Homelander's true destruction was not physical, but psychological. He had given others the example that, in the end, power corrupts, but the most devastating part was that narcissism had transformed him into something beyond redemption. The world now stood at a crossroads. Could humanity truly learn from its mistakes? Or, deep down, was the myth of Homelander not just about his downfall, but about the reflection of what everyone feared, yet no one dared to admit? Homelander's ego wasn't just the engine of his downfall, it was a distorted mirror of a universal human desire, the desire to be something more, to be more than human, to transcend limitations. But the question that lingers at the end of his journey is whether we can truly see what he represented. And worse yet, can we prevent him from being, in some way, repeated? Homelander may have been defeated, but what he left behind was not just the memory of a villain, but the shadow of what happens when someone loses touch with their own humanity. His true legacy is not the power he amassed, but the bitter lesson that, by distancing oneself from empathy and morality, one becomes not a god, but a monster. And maybe, he wasn't the last. Maybe the world, in its constant pursuit of power, is doomed to create more monsters like him, who seek, in their solitude and control, the only form of affirmation they know. Homelander was neither a hero nor a villain. He was a distorted reflection of everything a human being can become when ego overshadows empathy, when power replaces morality. His journey was not marked by glory or redemption, but by a spiral of destruction in which the only constant was his pursuit of control. But in the end, what he truly destroyed was not just the world around him. He destroyed the very idea that power can be wielded without humanity being lost in the process. And as the world began to rebuild itself, the lesson remained: the true downfall is not the one that happens on the battlefield, but the one that happens within ourselves, when we allow the desire to be more than we are to consume us. Homelander showed us what happens when someone crosses every boundary in the name of a distorted self-image, but the question that lingers is, who are we to judge? Perhaps, deep down, we all carry a little bit of Homelander within us. And maybe that's why it's so difficult to avoid the path he walked. When power calls, who can resist? But then again, maybe he wasn't the last. And maybe, in some way, this story hasn't ended here.